And if any of you want to keep these for your co-op, that's fine.
Stick them in.
Okay, yeah, why don't you take the one that's all labeled?
Whatever the deer goes.
You keep one? Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, I'll bring it.
So I think it's safe to say Gary did a pretty good job at keeping that as interesting as it possibly could be, right?
Craft beer, it gets everybody. I agree.
So now, if you're not so great at remembering all those details, this is a really great book. I don't know if Gary said anything about it or not, but it's Michigan Trees, a guide to trees of the Great Lakes region. So I'll have this around if anyone wants to look at it. It's only $20. It has a key for summer identifying, winter identifying. It has pretty pictures for every tree that's native in Michigan, including the buds and flowers and leaves and everything. So, really good tool. What most of you guys should have in front of you is this data sheet. This is the tool that we're going to use to look at how to actually assess our forests. So we'll be referring to that as we go through. So this next part we're going to look at, so we've learned all this great stuff. We've learned why it's important to look at our forests and understand what is happening on them. So how do we actually figure that out, and how do we quantify some of this stuff? So ideally, for this operates best when you're looking at about 500 acres. So you would have five transects or 5 lines that are straight, and they'd be about 1,000 feet apart. They'd be about 1 mile long. Okay, that's an ideal situation if you can do that. And that, again, that's over 500 acres. Now, for the sake of this is, I don't think I said this already today, but this is a pilot project that we're starting too. So some of your co-ops have already said that you want to be part of this pilot group and trying this out. I'm not as worried about meeting the protocol and having the 5 lines and 1 mile long and everything, because what those pilot groups are going to be doing is making sure that this sheet is understandable and usable, and that we have the training for those groups that they need to be able to identify the species that they'll be looking for. But if you really want to know and you really want a good estimate, you're going to do it within a 500 acre area with those transects set up. Then what you're going to do is about every 100 feet you're going to stop, and you'll have a stick that's about 4 feet long, and you're going to make a big circle with it. And within that circle area, you're going to look at the different species. So on this sheet, we'll talk about it in detail in a minute, but over here would be where you would put your high, medium, and low preference species. You'd pick 2 of each species. And if you're not super comfortable looking at stuff with buds, you might want to wait until next spring to do this assessment and go out and look at your woods this summer and figure out what you have a lot of. And on those lists that Gary gave us, figuring out, which ones for each category you could look at on your property come budding season. So you would be looking for those 6 plants in those 4-foot radius areas. You would do it after snowmelt, before green up. This has been a really funky winter, so I don't know how that's going to affect the deer pellet count of this, but something else you can do while you're walking those transects is look for deer poop. And every time you find a pile, you get to tally it down, and you can get some rough ideas or estimates per se of deer populations in your area too, just by counting deer scat. If you're going to do that, you need to have an idea on when the leaves dropped. There's a leaf drop date, and as soon as I figure out how to figure that out, I'll let you know. Because as far as I know, leaves drop over a period of time, but apparently there's a leaf drop date. So that's something that we need to know to do this.
With the deer pellets, do you count the number of pellets or the number?
It'd be the piles. Yep. So the individual, a group of pile. Yep. Good question. Any other questions you guys have while I'm going, just feel free to pop up.
How long does that last?
The pellets are all along the entire transect line, not just in the 4-foot.
So while you're walking your transect, you see a pile of poo, you count it. Mike?
How long does it last?
How long does the scat stick around?
Yeah.
Part of that's going to depend on the winter. So
that's right.
Yeah. So this winter, because it's been so warm and wet, it's going to be a whole different thing than if it was a legitimate winter where it was actually frozen most of the time.
Right.
So I don't know if that's going to be worth anything this spring or not. Brent, do you have anything? Never mind. So equipment that you'd want to use or wear while doing this kind of stuff is just briar-proof stuff. You want a clipboard and a pencil, and then your little data sheet here. A compass, I tried doing this with my smartphone compass, and that was worth nothing. So you want a legitimate compass that actually has a magnet-driven quiver thing. So smartphones aren't so great for this kind of scenario. A walking stick or something that actually measures out 4 feet, or if you have a pretty good idea on what 4 feet is, I mean, you can eyeball it, but the more accurate you go about this, the more accurate your information is going to be. So I'd recommend having a stick that has 4 feet marked out so you can get a good radius. And then what I'd recommend too is that for the 6 species that you're looking for, have a cheat sheet on that for what those buds look like and what some of those distinguishing characteristics might be. And I can help with that kind of stuff, so that's just something you'll want. For picking your line locations, ideally, again, I say ideally, you want something that covers multiple different habitat types and multiple covers. So you want to try to get some diversity, and part of that goes with having the 5 different lines, having it, looking at an aerial map and figuring out where some diversity is that you can plat that grid and run your transects from there. Again, 5 parallel lines, 1,000 feet apart. Making them as straight as possible. So when you're planning this, you want to try to avoid swamps and different obstacles that you'd have to go around, unless you plan on picking them back up at a certain spot. But you do want them to be straight. And part of that is that if you can make this replicatable, so you can do the same transects, or at least close every year, it'll be a good indication and a good comparison year to year. And you can work with your neighbors and their properties too, which is why the co-ops are a great place to have a pilot study for this. For your species selection, like I said, if you're not super comfortable, you're not already very confident and aware of what's on your property, waiting until next spring might be better off, so that you can take this summer and look at and evaluate what's already on your property so you can measure from there. And you have all the lists and stuff like that to know what ones would be categorized as high, medium, or low preference. I'd recommend having at least 2 people as you go out, like in a group together. So if, say you wanted to do the 500-acre thing and you have your 5 transects, you'd want at least 10 total people to do that. You want someone to help count steps, someone that specifically their only job is to take care of this data sheet. My coworker Sarah and I went out and did it on my property, and I was just getting all sorts of confused. And so that's part of why this is actually much more simple than the sheet I was working from. And it's also why I recommend that you at least have one other person, preferably 3 people on a team that's going through and doing this evaluation together. And that, for a couple reasons, it's to make sure that you keep everything straight, but it also just puts a couple other minds together that can help make sure you're identifying things correctly and run by your observations and conclusions by a couple other people. Data collection. So you have your line set, you have your compass, and you just start walking. You're doing your counting. So the way that we have this, if you look at the data sheet, is that approximately every 30 steps is when you'll be stopping. So 1, 2, 3. Just pick a foot, count it every time it hits the ground. And every 30 steps you stop, you look at your radius, and you look at those 6 plants and see what you can find there, and then you evaluate how heavily they've been browsed. So, at every plot you stop at, there's some data that you're going to have to record. If you look at this top section here, it says canopy cover. What you'll do, and the reason why this is important is because it helps quantify sunlight that's getting to the floor, and part of that is going to be an attribute too for how much regeneration there can be. If your crown cover is really thick, there's not sunlight getting down, your regeneration is going to be low whether there's deer or not. So what you would do is you would just look up at the canopy and estimate. If it's less than 50% coverage, then you'd put a minus sign. If it's more than 50% coverage, you'd put a plus sign. And that just helps count for other factors that might be involved in what's present and what's not. And then that next one down says regeneration at each plot, yes or no. You're just going to look. Maybe you're at a spot there's nothing growing on the floor, and you'd say no. If there's some stuff, some little twigs coming up, you would say yes. And so you would use this sheet for each line that you walk. So there's 50 boxes here. By the end of your walk, you should have all 50 boxes filled out, indicating canopy cover and indicating regeneration. You guys following me so far? Okay. Do you want to turn the light back on for up here? Or are you just sleepy?
Yeah, that one might help.
You want to? Thanks, Brent.
Whoa.
Whew, we all awake now? Alright. So, like I said, these boxes here, there's 50 of them in each column. So for every plot, you mark an indicator in each one of those boxes. So by the time you've walked your whole transect, you should have all 50 of them filled out. Then what you're doing, so if your high preference species is, it's getting late, so I'm falling asleep here myself. What high preference species do you want to look at? Or white cedar?
Maples.
Maple? Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to look, if we have maples and white cedar here, then we're going to look at our little circle and we're going to evaluate and see if there's anything growing up there of those species. And if there are, we're going to look and we're going to figure out, is there any browse on them, or are pretty much all the buds accounted for? Is there light browse where some of the buds are gone, or is there really severe browse where that plant is hedged? And I'll have a picture up here in a minute showing you black and white what the difference between something that's hedged is and what something that's just lightly browsed is. And so you're going to look for all 6 of those species at each plot. You're going to look and see if they're there, and if they're there, you're going to evaluate how severe their browse is. So no browse, light browse, or really heavy browse. Still following me?
How big a plant do you look at?
It depends on where you are. So it could be a full-size tree. So if you're 30 steps, you stop and there's a big maple tree there, that's what's there. So that's why you want the diversity. So if you have areas of mature stands and you have some other areas that are a little bit more in the early successional category, then you'll see a lot of shrubby stuff coming up. When I was walking my property, there were times where it was really thick and we're just trying our best to go in a straight line and just plow through and try to count our steps. And other times you're just walking through. I have a pine stand, so we're just clear cutting, walking through there, no problem. So, yep. Okay, so this would be hedged. You can see that those little twigs are really thick where the sprouts are coming up where the buds are, versus this one is all very thin. So both of these are the same tree, the same species, but one has been very impacted by deer browse and the other one has not. So do you guys think that would stand out pretty easily if you're looking at some plants? So this would be lightly and this would be heavily.
How do you mark that on that chart with just a hash mark? Or?
Yeah, so there's 2 ways you can go about it. There's the dot method, which for 10 dots, or like for a set of 10, it would look like that versus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So just more concise and smaller space. So those are the 2 ways you could try tracking and counting to keep track of what you're seeing in those spots. Great question. So one or the other, whatever you want to do. Any other questions? Okay. So on interpreting the results. Now, granted, this data set's almost 10 years worth of tracking data. There's a co-op out in, is it Kinzu Co-op in New York or Pennsylvania? Pennsylvania. They have a bunch of these 5-line sections all over the place on this massive woodlot that they have. And so they've been tracking this for a long period of time. So they've been able to look at the deer densities and the different regenerations. So I think this is really hard to read anywhere, but one is no regeneration and the other one is regeneration. So they were just black and white looking at things, if new things were growing and if they weren't. And you can see that there's correlations between when deer density goes down, that regeneration starts going back up. That's a good thing. They worked really hard at targeting some of their deer populations to reduce numbers, and then were able to at the same time measure what regeneration was doing at the same time. So again, this is something that you would want to be regularly checking. It's not you do it once and you're done, but even if you do it once, you still get a pretty good idea if deer numbers are too high or not, if it's more than the habitat should be sustaining. But if you're looking at it a long term, and if you're, you like crunching numbers like I know Hunt does, they're a co-op, my data guys, that they love all sorts of numbers. So this would be another kind of thing that you could track over time and get some really good ideas on trends that's happening on your properties. If you want to calculate deer density, this is an estimate. This is not a a solid truth, but it gives you an idea or an approximation on what could be using that area as far as population goes, using the pellet counts. You can also do trail camera surveys where one camera, and this is in areas where you can legally bait, so I'm not promoting baiting in areas where it's not legal. But you can put a bait pile in front of a camera and then start recording, and I don't remember if it's 12 or 13 days or something, you pull it, you count all your pictures, and there's a whole little scenario worksheet that QDMA has that I can send you if you're interested, that you can get a good number on that. And I know that Phil's done that and has gotten some interesting numbers, and I'm sure you'll try it again next year and see how that compares. But it helps give a baseline, it helps give some quantifiable number to help you understand what populations might look like in your area, and if you need to raise them, or allow them to raise, or if you need to lower them. So it's just a tool, not something to live or die by. Other considerations, if you're fortunate where you have a lot more property to do a formal browse impact study on, then this kind of just outlines what you'll want to look at as far as setting transects and how many you want to do. Again, everything that I've talked about here, these are estimates. They're things that are to be compared over time. They're not something to bet a bunch of money on, but they can really provide a lot of insight on how your habitat's being used and at what level it's being maybe abused or just lovingly browsed off of by your deer. Ooh, now it's really dark. So, that being said, are there any questions about this little piece of paper here?
What if you have less than 500 acres? How many transect lines? Is it just?
Yeah, so my property is 12 acres. So I just did a line straight back on each side and just tried it out. I mean, you're getting information no matter what. So if you can get a couple transects, again, especially if you're crossing multiple cover types, that's going to help as well. But in order to use this to really get the numbers scientifically, you would want to do more than that. But if you're just for your own curiosity, which a lot of us, I thought it was fun to do. And I learned a lot about deer and how they're using my property too, just by walking through and looking at what's being browsed on.
What would you do, like if you were going from woodlot to woodlot, going across the ag field,
Mm-hmm.
that sort of thing? You're obviously, you're not looking for native browse species. You just do maybe your pellet counts is all, or
You could. I would lengthen your transect at that point. So just make it where the ag fields don't count for the transect. And then if you're going to do the pellet count, then you'd have to modify the calculations a little bit to account for that distance.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to point out, historically when the department used pellet surveys in some of our northern regions, we did in forested areas. So you'd have the leaf fall from the fall before covering any remaining deer pellets, and the deposition when you're going out in the springtime is just what came from within that last year. Farm fields and how long they persist and other things, it leaves it a lot more open. Obviously if it's a cultivated field, you're not going to have them remaining for multiple years or anything like that, but it's going to change a little if it's just a grass field or other area like that. So it really works best, and finding them on top of leaf litter is a lot easier than searching in a field of grass or something like that as you're going through.
other than just like following our river corridor, we're not going to have continuous pieces of woods.
And that'd be the other, in terms of looking at neighboring properties where you got, instead of everybody just doing a short little piece on each individual place, trying to run a transect through an area that's got forested cover, so you're going to be looking at these browsed woody species and coordinate, work together to be able to go property across property. In that case, if you're in a co-op, you might even not have many places at all on your own individual property, but if you're willing to help run transects, in other places, those deer are still, what they're doing with habitat and what it's providing for them is still affecting what you're going to see on your land as well. You just might not have the best individual place on your own to do monitoring.
Mike?
Deer's poop 25 times a day.
That's what it says. That's what the research says. Yeah. If you're constantly eating, I'd imagine that changes some behaviors a little bit.
I thought most of the pellets were like when they bed down and get back up, Just look up.
You learn something here.
Yeah.
Can you
Really?
review
Shoot all
that,
over.
that is calculating deer density formula again?
Yeah.
That's all I got.
So how this goes is, so the top would be the number of pellet groups that you count. And again, this is over, if you're doing it based on the criteria that I said, so over a mile distance, and that's kind of the numbers they open in there. But so the pellet groups per day is going to be that 25 number. And then the days since leaf off is going to be that next number you're going to put in. Do you know where to find that information? How do you figure out the official
It
leaf
was always
off
kind of
date?
observational for looking at, as you're going out and looking at the progression of that drop. It's going to change with rain and wind and other things, so you have to kind of establish that as a date if you want to do that
Yeah.
calculation to get to a density, figure out when that starting point is.
Yep.
So it's when all the leaves are off?
Yeah, yeah.
Like November 15th, do it.
Yeah.
Unless you got all red oaks.
And then the plot area here, so according to this
Put it
one,
on your neighbors, that's it. You gotta get it.
it would be, so the number you would put in there would be this number right here if you're following the protocol that we've outlined. So this, whatever that equals, is what would go right here.
I have a question in regards to the pellet counts and this is over the wintering time. And obviously we all know that deer move to more thermal areas, which can not give you a more accurate, deer density during the fawning time, the summer, and also hunting time. Those obviously change throughout the year as deer migrate. How do we utilize this, or how do we calculate, or how does this information help us as hunters and as
So it
our harvest rates?
It depends on the extent of movement you're talking about. So if you're in an area where deer truly are migratory in our northern regions, in the days when the department used to utilize these, they'd be used really at a regional level. You wouldn't look at the deer density on this transect. We would be adding multiple transects from multiple counties and multiple areas to get a regional kind of estimate of how deer numbers were. So yeah, they were moving and concentrating at that winter time, but they were still spread out in that way to monitor over that period. So on your own individual property, again, that's why working with neighbors at some scale, apart from just one plot of land, will be better for giving you a general indicator of what's going on deer in your area. Looking at what's going on plot to plot really is only getting you an amount of use. So if you've done habitat improvements, you're going to see your deer pellets go up just because deer are spending more time there. It doesn't mean that you've all of a sudden increased the number of deer. And what's the number of deer on your 20 acres anyway? You've got 0 deer that reside year-round on a smaller piece of land like that.
When you're talking about expanding the amount of space, are you talking township-wide? Are you talking county-wide? What are you saying when you need to get larger?
And that's why if you're going to the extent of generating an actual estimate, there's a lot of limitations as to how that estimate is going to apply. If you're looking at, you have a 1,000-acre co-op and you establish some of these transects that you're going to be able to consistently use, I'd still be much less interested in looking at the deer density calculation than in looking at simply how those counts are changing over time. Using it as the number of pellet groups per course or something more as a general index as it went up or down. So no, it's not going to then get you a number that you can calculate how many you want to harvest, but it's still going to see increasing or decreasing. And then you'll again, by taking those systematic observations of different areas, it might not be telling you this one transect or these properties have seen a big change, but as you start to see more use there, it might not be more deer, but you can key in to think what's going on, that deer are using this area more than they were otherwise. No different than when you're setting your trail cameras out and sharing information, all of a sudden you see that some trail cameras get more hits and you start to realize deer are shifting the movement pattern or whatever. Yes. Another way of giving you a little bit of a fine scale interpretation, but certainly not a number of deer that are on this specific piece of ground.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Have you seen anybody else use like other data? I think somebody brought up the food plot as an example, but looking at like crop rotation or different kind of movement or hinge cutting and how that would affect deer browse.
Yeah.
Trying to correlate any of that.
I know that there's a study that was done recently in the northeast area. I cannot remember because I haven't read it yet, but it's sitting on my desk. But it's looking at that, and part of what they were looking at too is how far from wooded areas do you get into a field before you start seeing less deer browse on an ag land. So there is some research like that out there. If you email me, I can send you what I have. Yeah.
The end result of this is deer per square mile, correct?
Yeah. In a perfect world. Yeah. Yep. Any other questions? Okay. Let me turn this thing off here.